A 6-year-old girl, barefoot in a Boston blizzard, alone on a sidewalk outside one of the city's most dangerous addresses, asking a man the entire underworld feared if he knew anyone who wanted a child. Roman Holloway had ordered executions without blinking. He had broken men twice his size and buried secrets that governments couldn't uncover. But nothing, not one moment in 38 years of violence and silence, had prepared him for that question. This is the story of how a little girl with nothing left to lose walked into the life of a man with everything, and changed both of them forever. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The Girl on the Sidewalk. The cold that night had teeth. It came off the harbor in waves, the kind of January wind that didn't just chill you. It found the gaps between your ribs and settled there, heavy and mean. The streets around Back Bay were slick with a thin sheet of ice that had formed sometime after dark, when the temperature dropped 8 degrees in less than an hour and caught the city unprepared. The restaurants and bars were still lit and busy inside, but the foot traffic on the sidewalks had thinned to almost nothing. Nobody walked in Boston on a night like this unless they had no other choice. Roman Holloway had a car. He had 3 cars idling within half a block, 2 drivers, and a security detail of 4 men who were paid specifically to make sure he never had to stand in the cold longer than it took to cross 10 feet of pavement. But he'd dismissed them to the lobby of Ardent, one of the few restaurants in the city where the owner still called him by his first name without visible terror, because he wanted 90 seconds of silence before the night ended. That was all. 90 seconds of cold air and the sound of nothing before he climbed into the back seat and let the city recede. He was buttoning his overcoat when he heard the sound. Not a voice, at first, more like something between a breath and a shuffle, the scrape of something small against concrete. Roman's hand paused on the second button, and he turned his head, slow and practiced, the way men in his position learned to turn when they weren't sure what they were hearing. The reflex wasn't fear, it was assessment. She was standing against the exterior wall of the building next to Ardent, pressed into the narrow recess where the brick met the decorative ironwork at the base of a planter box that held a dead ornamental shrub. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her hair was dark and tangled and hung in clumps against her pale jaw. She was wearing a thin cotton dress, floral print, yellow and white, completely wrong for any season above 40 degrees, and nothing else. No coat, no shoes. Her feet were bare on the frozen pavement, and her arms were wrapped around herself in a way that looked less like a child's self-hug and more like someone trying to physically hold their own body together. She was looking at him. Roman Holloway stood 6'2" and weighed 220 pounds, and had not once in his adult life inspired the expression harmless in anyone who met him. His face was angular and hard in the way that certain men's faces go hard when they've been in enough rooms where things ended badly. He had a scar along his left jawline from something that happened when he was 23, and a way of holding very still that most people found more unsettling than movement. Children, in his limited experience, tended to press themselves against their parents when he walked through a room. This child did not press herself away. She watched him with dark eyes that were enormous in her thin face, and after a moment, in a voice so small it barely survived the wind, she said, "Do you know anyone who wants a child?" Roman didn't move. In 38 years of life, he had been asked for money, for mercy, for silence, for violence, for favors that required things he chose not to remember clearly. He had been asked for things by men who were crying and by men who were trying not to show it. He had been in rooms where the asking was a pretense, and everyone in the room understood the asking was a pretense, but performed it anyway because it was the last shred of dignity available. He had never been asked that. "What?" he said. The word came out flat, which wasn't his intention. It was the only word that arrived. "A child," she said again. She said it very carefully, like she was checking that she had the pronunciation correct. "Someone who wants one. Do you know anyone?" It wasn't phrased as a question the second time. Her voice had steadied into something that was attempting to be businesslike, But underneath the attempt was a trembling that had nothing to do with boldness and everything to do with the fact that she was 6 years old and barefoot on ice in January and had apparently exhausted every other available option. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and looked up and down the block. The sidewalk was empty in both directions. A cab moved through the intersection at the far end, its headlights cutting the dark and then disappearing. Nobody. He crouched down. Not fast. Slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller in increments the way you might with an animal that had been cornered enough times to interpret sudden movement as a threat. When he was at her level, he studied her face, and what he saw there did something to the inside of his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't pity, exactly. Pity was something you felt from a distance. This was closer than that. Her lips were blue. Not dramatically, not movie blue, but the particular shade of pale that skin goes when it's been cold for too long, and the body is quietly beginning to redirect warmth away from the extremities. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone that had gone greenish at the edges, which meant it was several days old. There were older marks at her wrists, faded to yellow, which meant they were older still. And her eyes. Her eyes were the thing that kept him crouched there longer than he'd planned because they held something that no 6-year-old's eyes should hold. Not grief. Not fear, exactly. Something past those two things, on the other side of them. The flat, careful stillness of a child who had learned that crying didn't help. "What's your name?" Roman said. "Lily." A pause. "I'm sorry to bother you." She apologized the way people apologized when they were braced for punishment, fast and reflexive, like a flinch converted into syllables. "You're not bothering me," Roman said. He kept his voice level. "How long have you been out here?" Lily's brow furrowed slightly. "I don't have a watch," she said, in a tone that suggested this was information she was mildly embarrassed not to have. "Since it got dark?" A small nod. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened up, slowly, and turned toward the lobby entrance of Ardent. He pulled out his phone and pressed one contact. It rang once. "Bring the car around," Roman said, "and tell Nora to meet me at the building, tonight." He ended the call and looked back down at the girl. She was watching him with the same careful attention she'd offered from the start. Not hopeful, not afraid, just waiting. Like a child who had learned to conserve hope the same way you conserved heat, spending neither more than absolutely necessary. Roman shrugged off his overcoat. It was cashmere, charcoal gray, worth more than most people made in a month. He crouched again and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, and it swallowed her whole, pooling on the frozen pavement at her feet. "Okay, Lily," he said. "Come with me." "Where?" she asked. "Somewhere warm," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those old, careful eyes. Then she nodded and took one step forward, and when her bare foot touched the ice, she hissed through her teeth, a small, involuntary sound that she immediately suppressed, pressing her lips together like she regretted making it. Roman looked at her feet. Then, without discussing it, he picked her up, coat and all, and carried her to the car. She didn't protest. She held very still, like she was afraid that movement might cause him to change his mind. The building Roman Holloway used as his primary operations center was a converted warehouse in the Seaport district that had, from the outside, the look of a mid-range commercial property. Unremarkable brick facade, dark windows, a single entrance on the street level that a person could walk past 100 times without giving it a second glance. What the exterior didn't reveal was the 3 floors of secure, climate-controlled space above, or the basement level below, or the fact that every entrance was monitored by cameras whose feeds ran to 6 different screens and were watched by men who rotated in 4-hour shifts around the clock. The building had 2 names. The official name, on the property record, was Seaport Commercial Holdings, LLC. The name everyone who worked for Roman used was simply the house. He brought Lily through the back entrance, and she held his coat around herself and looked at everything with a silence that was absolute. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make sounds of surprise or alarm, not even when they passed through the security corridor and the door sealed behind them with a sound like a vault. She just watched. Nora was waiting in the main room on the 2nd floor, which was where Roman spent most of his working hours. A large open space that contained a long table, several monitors, a bar that was more functional than decorative, and a sitting area with a leather couch and two chairs arranged around a low table near the windows. Nora Vasquez was 52 years old, small, and had been with Roman since before his father died and left him the organization. She wasn't warm, precisely, but she was steady in the way that particular mountains are steady, and her eyes, when they found the child in Roman's arms, went through 3 distinct stages in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and then a kind of settled determination that Roman recognized as the same thing he was feeling himself, whatever it was. "Her name is Lily," Roman said, setting the girl down carefully on the couch. She was outside Ardent, barefoot, since dark. Nora crouched in front of the couch and looked at Lily directly. Nora had a face that people tended to find difficult to read, which was deliberate, but there was nothing in her expression now except seriousness and attention. "Hi, Lily," she said. "Hi," said Lily, and then immediately, "I'm sorry for the trouble." Nora's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked up at Roman. Something passed between them. Not words, something older and quicker than words. And Nora stood. "I'll get some food and something warm to put on her," she said. It was not a question. "Frankie in the building?" Roman asked. "Second floor." "Get him too." Nora left. Roman sat in the chair across from the couch and looked at Lily, who was sitting with her legs folded under her and his overcoat still wrapped around her like a blanket. She was starting to shiver slightly as the warmth returned to her skin. The delayed reaction, the body remembering that it had been very cold and beginning to process it now that it was safe. She pressed her lips together when the shivers came, like that too was something she was trying not to let him see. "You don't have to be sorry," Roman said. "You haven't done anything wrong." Lily looked at him. She seemed to be considering whether this was true. "I walked a long way," she said finally. "From where?" A pause. She looked at her hands, which were still bluish at the knuckles. "Dorchester," she said. Roman kept his expression even. Dorchester to Back Bay on foot, in January, at night, barefoot. He did the rough calculation in his head and arrived at a number that meant she'd been walking for somewhere between 2 and 3 hours before he found her outside Ardent. He looked at her feet, which were raw and abraded, and had a quality to them that told him they'd been cold and wet, and cold again more than once over the course of the night. "You walked from Dorchester," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Why?" Lily was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers worked against the fabric of his coat, a small, unconscious motion. "I thought," she said slowly, picking the words with care, "that if I went somewhere different, maybe someone would want me there." Roman said nothing. There was nothing to say to that, nothing that would have been adequate, and he knew the difference between the moments that required words and the moments that required silence. This was the second kind. Frankie arrived 6 minutes later. Franco Mara was 31 years old, square-jawed, with the kind of energy that filled whatever room he was in. Not loud exactly, but present in a way that was hard to ignore. He was Roman's closest deputy, had been since he was 22, and he was also, for reasons that had surprised Roman when he first noticed it, and had long since ceased to, completely incapable of encountering a child in distress without doing something about it. He came through the door, clocked the situation in approximately 1 second, and then crossed the room and sat on the couch at a careful distance from Lily and said, "Hey, I'm Frankie. What's your name?" "Lily." "That's a good name. I had a fish named Lily once." He paused. "She was fine. Lived a long time. Very trustworthy fish." Lily looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The particular relaxation of the muscles around the mouth that happens just before the decision to smile. "Fish aren't trustworthy," she said. "They just swim." "That's what makes them trustworthy," Frankie said. "They always do exactly what you expect." This time, something that was actually a smile crossed Lily's face. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, and it was the smallest, most careful smile Roman had ever seen, like she was rationing it, like there was a limited supply, and she needed to be conservative. But it was there. Nora came back with a bowl of soup, chicken, from the kitchen on the first floor that Roman kept staffed because the alternative was too much takeout, and a pair of wool socks and a large sweatshirt with nothing written on it. She set everything on the low table in front of the couch and looked at Lily. "Can you eat?" Nora said. Lily looked at the soup. Her eyes did something complicated. Is it? She started, and then stopped and started again. Thank you, she said carefully. Thank you very much. She ate the way Roman had seen people eat who were not sure when they would eat again. Not fast and frantic, almost the opposite. Very deliberately, with a focused attention to each spoonful that went beyond hunger. She was rationing the experience of it, making it last, because some part of her brain had filed this under things that don't happen often and was insisting on thorough documentation. Roman watched her and felt something shifting around in his chest that he didn't entirely trust himself to examine yet. While Lily ate, Frankie kept a quiet, easy conversation going about nothing in particular. The fish, something he'd seen on television, whether soup was better with crackers or bread. And Lily responded in small, careful sentences, testing each exchange like ice she wasn't sure would hold her weight. Nora stood near the window with her arms crossed and her eyes on the child, and Roman sat in his chair and let the room do what it was doing. After the soup was gone, Nora helped Lily into the sweatshirt. It reached her knees. And the wool socks, and Lily submitted to this with a quality of stillness that was both cooperative and somehow absent, like she was accustomed to other people managing her physical situation while she waited somewhere else inside herself. When it was done, she sat back on the couch and looked at Roman. Are you going to call someone? She asked. Who should I call? Roman said. Lily's eyes dropped to her hands. My aunt, she said. Then, after a pause, I don't want you to. Tell me why. Another pause, longer. Because then I'll have to go back, she said. Roman leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Back where, Lily? She was quiet for a long time. The heat had come fully back into her face now, and her cheeks were pink, and her hands, where they rested on her knees, had returned to their normal color. She looked in this moment like a child who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Daryl's house, she said. Who's Daryl? My aunt's husband. She said it the same way you might say the name of a disease. Flat, accurate, absent of drama, because the drama had been processed somewhere a long time ago, and what was left was just the fact of it. Does Daryl hurt you? Roman said. Lily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the window, where the city lights were visible through the glass, orange and distant. He hurts everyone, she said, but mostly me, because my aunt is scared of him and she doesn't say anything, and I'm... She stopped, started again. I'm the easiest, she said. Roman held very still. When did you last eat before tonight? Frankie asked, his voice quiet and even. Lily thought about it. Yesterday morning, she said. Some bread. Frankie looked at Roman. Roman looked at Nora. Nobody said anything for a moment. Okay, Roman said. Lily, you're going to stay here tonight. Nobody is calling anyone tonight. You understand? Lily looked at him with those careful, ancient eyes. Why? She asked. Because you're cold and you walked 3 miles with no shoes, Roman said. That's reason enough. A small pause. Okay, she said. Then, I'm sorry to be trouble. You're not trouble, Roman said. He said it the same way he said most things, flatly, definitively, like a statement of fact that did not require the other party's agreement. But what he was aware of, underneath the steadiness, was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something with an edge to it that was going to require him to think carefully about what he did next. He had been in this business long enough to know the difference between problems that could be managed and problems that pulled you off your established course. He had always been very good at staying on his established course. He was aware, sitting there in the lamplight looking at a 6-year-old girl eating the last of the crackers Nora had brought, that this might be the thing he couldn't manage from a distance. He filed that away for later. Yes, Cal arrived at 11:30, which was later than Roman would have liked, but earlier than he'd expected given the hour and the weather. Calvin Reeves was Roman's head of information, the person Roman called when he needed to know things that weren't publicly available, which was most of the things Roman needed to know. He was 44, narrow-shouldered, with the perpetually distracted look of a man whose brain was running several processes simultaneously and whose face hadn't fully caught up. He came in through the security entrance, nodded at Frankie, took one look at the child asleep on the couch. Lily had gone out suddenly and completely, in the way children go to sleep when their bodies finally override their vigilance. And then looked at Roman. "That's a child," Cal said. "Observant," Roman said. "Sit down." Cal sat. Roman gave him the condensed version. Outside ardent, barefoot, the things she'd said. The name Daryl. When Roman finished, Cal was quiet for a moment, and then he pulled out his phone and began typing. "Lily Bennett," Roman said. "She said her last name when Frankie asked. She's 6, maybe 7. Parents dead," she said. "Aunt named..." She didn't say the aunt's name, but the husband's name is Daryl Kane. "Dorchester address?" "She said she walked from there, yeah." "Okay." Cal kept typing. "Give me tonight." "Take what you need," Roman said. "I want everything." Cal looked up from the phone. He looked at the sleeping child, and then back at Roman, and he read Roman's face the way he'd been reading it for 12 years. "Understood," he said. Roman stayed in the main room until Lily had been asleep for 2 hours, and the night had pushed past midnight into the dead zone hours, where the city went quiet, and even the building seemed to breathe differently. Nora had found a blanket from somewhere, and tucked it around the child with a precision that suggested she had done this before, a long time ago, in a life she didn't often reference. Frankie had eventually stretched out on the floor near the couch, with his jacket folded under his head, not sleeping exactly, just stationed there, the way he sometimes got when something struck him as important, and he didn't want to be far from it. Roman sat at the table with a glass of bourbon he wasn't drinking and looked at the windows. What kept returning to him was the question she'd asked. Not the content of it, the asking itself. The way she'd phrased it as a practical inquiry, the way she'd been standing there for hours in the January dark, working up to it, running the calculations, deciding that this particular block on this particular night was the best available option. A 6-year-old, alone on ice in a city of 700,000 people, had done a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that asking a stranger was better than going back. Better than going back to Daryl's house. Roman was not sentimental about violence. He had ordered it and performed it and lived adjacent to it for long enough that he understood it as a tool. Crude, unreliable, expensive in unpredictable ways, but sometimes the only implement available for a particular kind of problem. He did not regret its necessity. He did not lie awake examining the moral architecture of the choices he'd made, but there were categories of violence that he had never been able to file as simply necessary. The violence done to people who could not refuse it, could not prepare for it, could not understand it as anything other than the world informing them that they had no value. That category of violence had always been the one that sat differently in his chest, heavier and less resolvable, and he had arranged his operation over the years to stay away from it, not out of sentimentality, but out of something closer to principle, and something closer still to a bone-deep and wordless fury at what it did to the people it was done to. He looked at the child asleep on his couch, the way she'd apologized for existing, the way she'd eaten, the specific quality of those eyes. He thought about a man named Daryl Kane, who apparently considered a 7-year-old the easiest target available, and who had been using that assessment for what the bruises on her face and wrists suggested was a very long time. Roman picked up his bourbon, looked at it, set it back down. He would wait for Cal's information. He would be methodical. He would not make moves before he had the full picture, because making moves before you had the full picture was how men in his position made catastrophic errors, and Roman Holloway had not survived this long by being impulsive. But he was aware, sitting in the quiet dark of the room, listening to the small, even breathing of a child who had walked 3 miles through a Boston winter to find someone who might want her, that whatever came next was going to require things from him that went beyond strategy. He could feel it settling in, slow and certain, the way decisions that have already been made at a level below conscious thought eventually surface into awareness. He was going to find out exactly who Daryl Kane was, and then he was going to make sure the man understood precisely what it meant to have Roman Holloway's attention. At 2:40 in the morning, Lily made a sound, not a cry, something smaller than that, a sharp intake of breath, and then a low, tight sound that was trying not to be a sob and not quite succeeding. Roman was at the table, and he looked up, and she was sitting on the couch with the blanket pressed to her chest, her eyes open and very wide, and for a moment she didn't seem to know where she was. He rose from the table without rushing, walked to the couch, crouched down at the edge of it so he was at her level. "You're okay," he said. "You're at the house. You're safe." Lily looked at him. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, and her hands were gripping the blanket. Then, slowly, her eyes focused, and the rapid breathing began to slow. "I thought," she started. She stopped. "Dream," Roman said. She nodded, small and quick. "You're okay," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands loosened their grip on the blanket, degree by degree. "Are you going to make me go back in the morning?" she asked. Roman looked at her. He thought about what it cost a child to ask that question at 3 a.m. in a strange place full of strangers, to make that calculation and decide that not knowing was worse than asking. "No," he said. The word landed simply. Lily studied his face with those careful, weathered eyes, checking it the way you'd check a structure for load-bearing capacity before trusting your weight to it. "You promise?" she said. Roman had not made a promise like that to anyone in a very long time. He was deliberate about promises. He understood their cost, understood that men who made promises they couldn't keep were unreliable in exactly the ways that got people killed in his line of work. He only promised what he could deliver. He looked at Lily Bennett, wrapped in a wool blanket in his main room at 3 a.m, asking him with eyes too old for her face whether he was going to send her back to the man who had been hurting her for years. "I promise," Roman Holloway said. Lily looked at him for another long moment. Then she lay back down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. In 4 minutes, she was breathing steadily, and in 6, she was asleep again. Roman returned to the table. He sat down. He picked up his phone and sent a single message to Cal. "Tonight, not tomorrow." Cal's reply came back in under a minute. "Already working. You're not going to like what I'm finding." Roman set the phone down and looked at the sleeping child and thought about all the things he wasn't going to like, and the long, specific list of things he was going to do about each of them. When morning came and Cal walked through the door with his laptop and a look on his face like a man who had spent several hours reading things he wished he hadn't, Roman was ready to hear it. He poured 2 coffees, pushed one across the table, and said, "Tell me everything." Cal opened the laptop, pulled up the file he'd assembled in the hours between midnight and dawn, and began to talk. And with every sentence, the thing that had been settling in Roman's chest since the moment on the sidewalk went quieter and harder and colder, until by the time Cal finished talking, it had become something that was no longer moving at all, something fixed and permanent and absolute. Roman had entered the building the previous night as a man who had found a child in the cold and made a decision not to abandon her. He was leaving this conversation as something else entirely. He just didn't know yet how much that difference was going to cost the man named Daryl Kane, or how much it was going to change Roman himself in ways he couldn't yet measure or name. Cal's file was 11 pages. Roman read it twice. The first time fast, the way you read something when you're trying to get the shape of it. The second time slow, stopping on certain lines, going back to certain dates, making sure he was reading what he was actually reading and not projecting something onto a document that wasn't there. When he finished the second pass, he closed the laptop and sat with both hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose for a moment. Cal watched him do this without speaking. He had learned, over 12 years, when Roman needed the room to be quiet. "Start from the beginning," Roman said, out loud. Cal pulled the laptop back, opened it, but didn't look at the screen. He'd read it enough times that he had it. Lily Ann Bennett, 6 years old, turned 7 in November. Parents are Marcus and Claire Bennett, both deceased. Marcus died in a construction accident 3 years ago. Scaffolding collapse. Worksite in Quincy. Claire Bennett died 14 months later. Coroner listed it as cardiac arrest, but she was 31 years old and had no documented cardiac history, and the attending physician at the ER noted in his notes that the presentation was, Cal paused, chose his words, inconsistent with natural causes. Nothing was pursued. Why not? No next of kin pushing for an investigation. Claire's sister, Renata Kane, née Bennett, was listed as the surviving family member, and she declined an autopsy. Roman looked at the table's surface. Renata Kane. Married to Daryl Kane, yes. She took custody of Lily after Claire died. Formally. There's a family court record. It went through without challenge because there was nobody to challenge it. Cal cleared his throat. Lily's been in the Kane household for approximately 22 months. 22 months, Roman repeated. Daryl Kane, 43. Prior arrests, 2. Assault charges, both pleaded down. 1 in 2018, 1 in 2021. No convictions. He works, on paper, as an independent contractor. Landscaping, renovation work. In reality, Cal paused again, and this pause was different from the first one, heavier. In reality, he has a significant relationship with a man named Pete Okafor, who runs a mid-level gambling operation out of 2 locations in Dorchester and 1 in Roxbury. Kane has been a regular since at least 2020. His current debt to Okafor's operation is approximately $68,000. The room was very quiet. $68,000, Roman said. Give or take. The number has been climbing. He's been making partial payments over the last 4 months that have kept Okafor from escalating, but the payments have been inconsistent, and they've been getting smaller. Roman thought about the number. He thought about a man with $68,000 in gambling debt and a 7-year-old girl in his house and no other visible assets, and he thought about how the arithmetic of that situation resolved, and the thing in his chest went another degree colder. He was planning to sell her, Roman said. It wasn't a question. Cal was quiet for a moment. I found a name in Okafor's network, he said. A man named Greer, who operates as a intermediary for a specific kind of transaction. He stopped. There's a text message chain. I pulled it through a contact. It's between Kane and a number that traces back to Greer. The most recent message is from 6 days ago. Kane asks when they can finalize the arrangement. Greer says he needs 2 more weeks to find a buyer. Roman stood up. He didn't do anything else. He just stood and walked to the window and looked out at the harbor, which was gray and flat in the early morning light, the water the color of old steel. Frankie was still on the floor near the couch. He'd been awake for the last 20 minutes, lying still with his eyes open, listening. Now he sat up. He looked at the back of Roman's head and then at Cal, and Cal gave him a small nod that confirmed what Frankie's face said he'd already understood. 2 weeks, Frankie said very quietly. Approximately, Cal said. Lily was still asleep. Her breathing was even and slow. One hand curled under her cheek, the blanket pulled up to her ear. She had turned onto her side at some point in the night, and in that position she looked smaller than she had the evening before, which Roman would not have thought possible. He looked at her and then looked back at the harbor. I want everything on Greer, he said, and I want Okafor's full operation, locations, personnel, debt records, all of it. I can have it by end of day, Cal said. By noon, Roman said. Cal typed something. By noon, he confirmed. Roman turned from the window. His face was composed in the way it went composed when the decision had been made, and what remained was only execution, the particular blankness of a man who had stopped deliberating and started moving. Don't contact anyone until I say, he said. Nobody moves on anything. Clear? Clear, Cal and Frankie said, almost simultaneously. Roman looked at the sleeping child one more time. Then he went to his office on the 3rd floor, closed the door, and didn't come back down for an hour. Lily woke up at 7:15 and spent approximately 45 seconds completely still, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes, running through wherever she'd been in her sleep, and landing back in the room with the slow, careful process of a child who had learned not to move until she understood her situation. Then she turned her head and found Nora sitting in the chair across from the couch, reading something on a tablet, and something in Lily's face shifted fractionally. Morning, Nora said, without looking up from the tablet. Good morning, Lily said. She sat up and looked around. The room was lighter than it had been. Frankie was gone. Cal was gone. Roman was not in the main room. Where's... Roman's working, Nora said. You want breakfast? A pause. Yes, please, Lily said, and then, I'm sorry for... Stop apologizing, Nora said, not unkindly. She set the tablet down and looked at Lily directly. You don't have to apologize for anything in this building. Not to anyone. Understood? Lily looked at her. She processed this instruction with evident seriousness, the way she seemed to process most things, examining it, turning it over, checking it for reliability. Okay, she said finally, with the tone of someone making an honest attempt that she was not entirely confident she could sustain. Nora brought eggs and toast and orange juice. Lily ate all of it. Afterward, Nora sat across from her with a mug of coffee and said, "Can I ask you something?" Lily looked at the mug. "Okay. How did you find that block, the one where Roman found you?" Lily was quiet for a moment. "I walked until the restaurants looked expensive," she said. "I thought, expensive restaurants have people with money. People with money can decide things easier." She paused. It took a long time to find the right block. Nora looked at her for a moment. "That was smart," she said. "It didn't always work," Lily said. "I asked other people before. They walked away." She said this without self-pity, reporting it like weather. "How many people did you ask?" 11, Lily said. Nora set her mug down carefully. 11 people walked away. Yes. Lily looked at the window. Roman didn't. Nora was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was the same, even, low, without performance, but something underneath it had shifted. "No," she said. "He didn't." Roman came down at 9 with the focused, slightly hollow look of a man who had spent an hour thinking through the range of available options and arrived at the end of that process with most of them discarded. He poured coffee at the bar and leaned against the counter and looked at Lily, who was now cross-legged on the couch with a children's book that Nora had found somewhere, an old one, its spine cracked, a story about animals with a lighthouse, and was reading with the same focused attention she gave to everything. "What are you reading?" he said. Lily looked up. "A story about a seal," she said. "The lighthouse keeper saves it." "Is it good?" She considered. "The seal doesn't talk," she said. "I think it would be better if it talked." "Maybe," Roman said. He drank his coffee and watched her read for a moment, and then he said, "Lily, I need to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer anything that you don't want to answer, but some of what you tell me will help me figure out how to keep you here." Lily lowered the book. She looked at him with full attention, the seal story instantly secondary. "Okay," she said. "Did Daryl know you left?" A small hesitation. "No, he drinks at night. He doesn't check on me until morning. I left before he went to sleep while he was busy." The last word carried a weight that suggested busy was a substantial euphemism. "Does he know where to look for you, people you might go to?" "There's no one to go to," Lily said simply. "I don't go to school. He took me out." She said this without particular emphasis, like she was describing a minor schedule change. "He said school was expensive." Roman kept his expression neutral. "Before you left, did he say anything about plans? Things that were going to happen soon?" Lily looked at her hands. Her fingers curled slightly. "He talked to someone on the phone," she said, 2 nights ago. I wasn't supposed to hear. He was in the kitchen, and I was in the closet. I sleep in the closet sometimes when he's in a bad mood, and I could hear him talking." She paused. "He said he needed the money by the 15th. He said the thing would happen before then." Roman set his coffee down. "The thing," he said. "He said the thing." "Yes." "Did he say anything else?" Lily thought. Her brow furrowed. He said she was small for her age, but that shouldn't matter for what they wanted her for." She said it the way she'd apparently processed it at the time, not fully understanding it, filing it as something adults said that didn't make sense, the way children file things they've caught the weight of without grasping the meaning. Then she looked at Roman's face, and something in his expression, some microscopic shift that he hadn't fully controlled, made her go very still. "What did that mean?" she said. Roman looked at her for a moment. He thought about what to say and what not to say, and he thought about what she'd already absorbed and survived. And he made the decision that honesty contained honesty, was the only thing that respected what she had already demonstrated she was capable of carrying. It meant someone was trying to make a bad decision about you, he said. And it's not going to happen. Lily studied him. Because you're stopping it. Yes. Another study, longer. How? That's what I'm working on, Roman said. Lily looked at him for one more moment. Then she picked the book back up and turned to her page and went back to the seal. Okay, she said. And that was that. The whole exchange filed and accepted and set aside, not because she didn't care, but because she had decided to trust the information and move on. The way people who have been in genuine danger learn to trust a structure when they find one that holds. Roman watched her read and felt the thing in his chest tighten another degree. Daryl Kane arrived at 11:47 in the morning. He didn't knock. He hit the exterior door of the building with the flat of his palm 3 times, hard, the kind of knock that was announcing something rather than requesting anything. And when the door didn't immediately open, he hit it again. Roman security, 2 men on the entrance, a third monitoring the cameras, had flagged the approach 4 minutes before contact. Roman was at the table when his phone buzzed. He looked at the camera feed image Cal had forwarded and felt a strange, cold stillness move through him, different from the operational stillness he used when he was working. This one was older, more animal. The man on the screen was large, soft in the wrong places, with a jaw that had been thick once and now carried extra weight beneath it. He was wearing a work jacket and jeans and a look on his face that was trying to perform authority and only managing belligerence. He hit the door a 3rd time. Roman looked at Lily. She was still on the couch. She hadn't heard the door from up here, couldn't have. The floors were solid and the soundproofing was good. She was at a part in the book where the seal was in danger and she was reading with her lip pressed between her teeth, fully inside the story. Nora, Roman said quietly. Nora was already moving. She crossed the room to the couch, sat down beside Lily with a naturalness that was almost theatrical, and said something quiet to the girl. Lily looked up, asked something, and Nora said something else and picked up the tablet from the side table and handed it to her. Within 90 seconds, Lily was absorbed in something on the screen with headphones Nora had produced from somewhere settled over her ears. Roman stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Frankie, who was standing near the door to the stairs with his arms loose at his sides and his face entirely empty of expression. "Bring him to the front room," Roman said. "Ground level." "Just him?" "He came alone?" "Camera shows 1 vehicle, 1 occupant," Frankie said. "Bring him to the front room," Roman repeated. T8. Daryl Kane did not look like a man who had expected to wait. He had the energy of someone who had worked himself up over the course of a morning and arrived at the front end of that energy primed to discharge it, and the experience of being walked through a security corridor and left standing in a bare, well-lit room with a single table and 4 chairs had apparently done nothing to cool him off. When Roman walked in, Kane turned fast. His eyes were small and pale and bloodshot at the corners. He looked Roman up and down with the assessment of a man who had spent enough time in rooms with dangerous people to have developed a surface-level read of them, and came up, Roman could see, with the wrong answer. Kane looked at Roman's jacket, his posture, the absence of visible weapons, and made the calculation that this was a businessman, that a businessman could be talked to in a particular way. "Where is she?" Kane said. Not a greeting. Roman noted the absence. "Sit down," Roman said. "I'm not sitting down. I want to know where the—" "Sit down," Roman said again. Exactly the same volume, exactly the same cadence. It was, by his count, the last time he was going to say it. Something in Kane's read of the room recalibrated fractionally. He pulled out a chair and sat, though his posture held the shape of a man who was sitting under protest and wanted that fact acknowledged. Roman sat across from him. He put nothing on the table. He folded his hands and looked at Daryl Kane and let the silence run for several seconds. "She's my ward," Kane said. "Legally. I've got guardianship papers. The court—" "I know about the court filing," Roman said. Kane stopped. "I know about the guardianship. I know about your wife. I know about Pete Okafor." Roman paused, watching Kane's face do something complicated. "I know about the debt. I know about Greer." Kane's mouth opened, closed. His jaw worked like he was chewing on a response, and none of them were landing right. His hands, on the table in front of him, were large and roughed up, and one of them had a scab across the knuckles that was maybe 4 days old. Roman looked at the scab and then looked back at Kane's face. "You don't know what you think you know," Kane said. "I know she hasn't been in school," Roman said. "I know she eats bread. I know she sleeps in the closet when you're in a bad mood. I know she walked 3 miles in January with no shoes on to find someone who might want her because the alternative was going back to your house and waiting for the 15th. The color in Kane's face had been doing something over the course of this. It started red, the flush of aggression, and moved through several stages and was now something closer to pale, though it was a pale undercut with effort, a man trying to hold his face in a position that suggested he wasn't afraid. "She ran away," Kane said. "Kids run away. That's not—" "Stop," Roman said. Kane stopped. Roman looked at him for a moment. He thought about Lily's face at 3 in the morning asking if she had to go back. He thought about the scab on Kane's knuckle. He thought about the word arrangement in a text message. "Here's what's going to happen," Roman said. "You're going to leave this building. You're not going to contact the court or Okafor or Greer or anyone else about the girl. You're going to go home and you're going to wait to hear from me." Kane's face went through something else. The pail held, but the effort behind it shifted into something that was starting to look, underneath, like the beginning of rage. "She's my legal ward," he said. You can't keep her. I'll call the police." "Call them," Roman said. The room was very quiet. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Kane said. Roman looked at him. He had been told that by better men in worse circumstances, and he had a very particular stillness he employed in response to it, a stillness that communicated without words or visible threat the full and specific weight of what he was and what he was capable of. He employed it now. Daryl Kane looked back at him for approximately 4 seconds. Then he pushed his chair back from the table. "This isn't over," Kane said. "I know," Roman said. Kane left. Frankie walked him out. Roman sat at the table and listened to the door close and thought about the phrase, "this isn't over," and about how much of the work ahead of him was now going to have to move faster than he'd initially planned. Because Kane was frightened, and frightened men with $68,000 in debt and a deadline 2 weeks away did not go home and sit quietly and wait. They made calls. They made desperate, accelerated decisions. They burned down the timeline. He was already reaching for his phone when Frankie came back in. "He's going to move fast," Frankie said. "Yes," Roman said. "How fast do we need to move?" Roman was already dialing Cal. "Faster," he said. Tartan. What none of them accounted for was Lily. Not that she'd done anything wrong. She hadn't. But at some point between Nora handing her the tablet and Daryl Kane's departure from the ground floor, she had taken the headphones off. Just briefly, she told Nora later, because the left one was uncomfortable. And in that brief window she had heard nothing specific, nothing definitive, but she had heard a sound from somewhere below that she recognized the way any child recognizes certain sounds without being told what they mean. A voice with a particular pitch. A specific quality of controlled anger. By the time Roman came back upstairs, Lily was sitting on the couch without the tablet and without the book. And she was very still, and her face had gone back to the look it held when he'd found her outside Ardent. The careful, braced quality of a child who had learned to pre-absorb impact. Roman stopped when he saw her face. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her and looked at her directly. "He was here," she said. It wasn't a question. Roman didn't see the point of lying to her. "Yes." Lily's hands were in her lap. They gripped each other. "Is he coming back?" "Not today. But he's coming back." Roman looked at her. "I'm going to take care of it," he said. "You don't have to." "Is he coming back?" she said again, and this time her voice had something different in it. Not louder, but harder. The specific hardness of a child who was past the point of being managed and needed the actual information. Roman held her gaze. "He's going to try," he said. "I'm not going to let him." Lily sat with that for a moment. Then, "What if you can't stop him?" "I can stop him." "How do you know?" "Because stopping people is what I do," Roman said. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, the same way he might have said that Cal handled information or Nora handled logistics. It was simply true, and he said it simply. Lily looked at him. She was doing the thing she did. The weight-bearing assessment, checking the structure before committing, and Roman held still and let her do it. Okay, she said, but she said it differently than she had in the night, when the word had carried something close to trust. This time it carried something more conditional, something that would require demonstration. He noted the difference. Roman nodded, stood, and went to find Cal. He had 24 hours before Kane made his next move. He intended to use every minute of them. He was 3 feet from the door when his phone buzzed, and he looked down at the screen and saw the name and felt the cold thing in his chest crystallize into something absolute. It was Cal. The text was 4 words. Greer moved his timeline. Roman looked back at Lily, who had picked the seal book up again and was holding it without reading it, staring at the page without seeing it, her jaw set and her small hands gripping the spine. Then he looked at the message again. The 15th was no longer the deadline. They had days, not weeks, and somewhere in the city, a man named Greer had just started the clock. The message sat on Roman's phone screen for 3 seconds before he moved. 3 seconds was a long time for him. Long enough that Frankie, who had been watching Roman's face from across the room with the trained attention of a man who had learned to read that particular face the way sailors read weather, took 1 step forward before Roman held up a hand and stopped him. Roman typed back to Cal. "Where are you?" The reply came in under 30 seconds. "Downstairs. Come now." Roman looked at Lily one more time. She still had the book open in her lap, still wasn't reading it, her eyes fixed on some middle distance between the page and the window. She had the look of a child running internal calculations. Not panicking, not crying, just processing, the way she seemed to process everything with a seriousness that belonged to someone 3 times her age. He looked at Nora. Nora nodded once, already moving toward the couch. Roman went downstairs. Cal had set up in the small back room on the ground floor that served as a secondary operations space. 2 monitors, a secondary router, equipment that didn't need to be explained. He was standing when Roman walked in, which was unusual. Cal generally sat. The fact that he was standing, with his jacket still on and his hands braced against the edge of the table, told Roman more than the text had. "Talk," Roman said. "Greer contacted Kane 40 minutes after Kane left this building," Cal said. He turned one of the monitors so Roman could see the screen. A text chain, time-stamped, pulled through channels Roman didn't ask about because knowing the channels sometimes created its own problems. Kane told him there was a complication. Didn't use specifics, he's not completely stupid, but he told Greer the girl was currently unavailable and that he needed more time. And Greer said his buyer is in the city now. Not in 2 weeks. Now. He flew in this morning. Cal pointed to a line on the screen. Greer's exact words. "You have 72 hours to produce her or the debt transfers to you personally, and I collect it a different way." Roman read the line. He read it twice. "The buyer is already here," Roman said. "Already here?" "Who is he?" Cal's jaw tightened. "That took me a while to run down. The number Greer used to communicate with the buyer is a burner, but there's a pattern in the cell tower pings that puts him consistently in the financial district since this morning. I cross-referenced with hotel registries, so there's a name at the Langham that flags against an Interpol watch list, not a warrant." "A watch list." Cal paused. "His name is Aldrich Voss. He's Belgian, operates out of 3 different European jurisdictions, and he has a documented history of acquisitions in the specific category we're discussing. The watch list notation is from 2019. Nothing has been prosecuted. Because nobody's built a case. Because nobody who's tried to build a case has been able to get witnesses to hold," Cal said. 2 separate attempts. Witnesses recanted both times. Roman stood very still and looked at the monitor. He thought about the word acquisitions and the specific category it represented and felt something in him. Something that lived below the operational, below the strategic, in a place that didn't have professional language attached to it. Go absolutely rigid. 72 hours, Roman said. Starting approximately 40 minutes ago, Cal said. So call it 71. Roman straightened up. He turned away from the monitor and stood facing the wall for a moment, which was something he did when he needed the visual field clear to think. Cal waited. The room was very quiet except for the hum of the equipment. "Pull everything on Greer," Roman said. "Physical location, movement pattern, who he uses for logistics. I want it in 2 hours." "I can do that." "And I want Voss's room number at the Langham." He turned back. "Not for tonight. I need to know where he is. That's all right now." Cal was already typing. "The Kane problem," he said, without looking up. "He's going to try to take her, not through the courts. Kane's not patient enough for courts right now, and he knows the courts won't move fast enough for Greer's timeline. He's going to try something direct." "I know," Roman said. "When?" "Tonight or tomorrow morning," Roman said. "He'll want to try to grab her somewhere outside this building, somewhere he can claim was a misunderstanding if it goes wrong." He paused. "She doesn't leave the building. She hasn't asked to. Keep it that way for now." Roman was already moving toward the door. "Get me Greer's location. Everything else waits." He went back upstairs and he stood in the doorway of the main room for a moment and looked at the scene in front of him. Lily had migrated from the couch to the floor, where she was sitting cross-legged near the low table, and Nora was sitting across from her, and between them was a deck of cards spread out in the arrangement of a simple matching game. Lily was studying the cards with the focused attention she gave to everything, and Nora was watching her with an expression that, on Nora's face, was as close to tender as that face was capable of getting. Lily looked up when Roman came in. Her eyes asked the question her mouth didn't. "Everything's fine," Roman said. He said it smoothly, without a pause, because the pause would have told her something and she was too good at reading information in pauses. "You eat lunch yet?" "Nora made sandwiches," Lily said. "There's one left if you want it." "I'm good," Roman said. He crossed to the bar, poured water, drank it. He stood at the bar and looked out the window at the harbor and ran the timeline in his head for the 4th time, checking it for gaps, for places where the math didn't hold, and found the same 2 problems he'd found the first 3 times. The first problem was Greer. Greer was operational. He had a buyer in the city and a 71-hour window, and he was not going to sit on that passively. He would apply pressure to Kane, and if Kane couldn't produce, he would attempt to resolve the situation himself, which meant acquiring resources, which meant men. The second problem was the one Roman liked least. He had good security on this building, but good security was designed for specific threat profiles, and the threat profile had just changed. Before today, he'd been managing a desperate individual, Daryl Kane, frightened, acting alone, working on emotion rather than strategy. Now he was managing a network. A small one, possibly, but networked threats were geometrically more complicated than individual ones, and the geometry got worse when the timeline was compressed. 71 hours. He needed to move Greer out of the equation before Kane could act. And to move Greer out of the equation, he needed leverage that was faster and cleaner than the legal route, which would take longer than 71 hours, and more controlled than the direct route, which created exposure he didn't want right now with Lily in the building. He needed something in between. He was still working through what that looked like when Frankie appeared at his shoulder. "Problem," Frankie said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the floor game across the room. Roman looked at him. "Tommy Rell just called," Frankie said. Tommy Rell was the man Roman used for 3 specific neighborhoods in Dorchester. Not a lieutenant, more of a local liaison, someone who kept ears in places Roman's more visible people couldn't go without creating attention. "He says there are 2 men sitting in a car on the block behind Kane's house. Not Kane's regular associates. He doesn't recognize them." "Since when?" "Tommy clocked them about 40 minutes ago. Says they haven't moved." Roman set the water glass down. "Description of the vehicle. Gray Chevy Tahoe and no plates on the front. Tommy couldn't get the rear without being seen." "Greer's people," Roman said. "That's what I'm thinking," Frankie said. "They're not watching Kane's house. Tommy said their sight line goes the other direction, toward the park." Roman went still. The park. He thought about that for a moment. There was a small park 3 blocks from Kane's address. Roman knew the area because Cal had pulled the street layout the previous night. It was the kind of park that existed in residential Dorchester neighborhoods. A half-block of old equipment and chain link, the sort of place a child might logically be taken by a guardian figure. The sort of place that was, in the language of surveillance, a natural funnel. One entrance, limited sight lines from the street, the surrounding buildings blocking angles. They already picked the location, Roman said. Looks like. Which means Kane gave them a pattern, something Lily does. Or something he told them she does. Frankie nodded slowly. She doesn't go to school. She doesn't go anywhere that anyone would have a record of. What does she do? Roman thought. He looked at Lily, still bent over the card game, moving a card carefully with 2 fingers. He thought about what she'd told him, the scattered details, the closet, the bread, the phone call she'd overheard. Then he thought about what Kane would have told Greer to establish credibility, to prove he had access to the girl, to justify the arrangement. He told them about the park, Roman said. It's the one place he takes her, or took her. It was probably the one time she was outside the house with any regularity. He paused. He gave them her routine. Her routine from Kane's house, Frankie said, which means they don't know she's here. They think she's still with Kane. They think Kane's going to bring her to the park, Roman said, or arrange for her to be there, and they're going to pick her up in transit. He looked at Frankie. Get Tommy to hold his position and do nothing. Do not approach the vehicle. Do not let them see he's watching. And get me Cal. Frankie moved. Roman turned back to the room and saw that Lily had looked up from the card game and was watching him with those careful reading eyes. He made himself look neutral, unhurried. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the cards. He had the sudden specific thought that she was the most perceptive person in the building, including everyone who was paid to be perceptive. Cal confirmed it within the hour. The Tahoe's partial plate, Tommy had gotten a partial from a different angle without being seen, traced to a shell company with a document trail that went through 2 layers before touching the edge of Greer's logistics network. Greer had moved the same day Kane showed up at the building. He hadn't waited. He'd already been escalating before the confrontation, which meant Kane had called him from outside Ardent's lobby before he'd even knocked on Roman's door. That piece of information reorganized several things in Roman's understanding of the morning. Kane hadn't come to the building to negotiate. He'd come to do reconnaissance, to confirm Lily was there, to establish the location, to give Greer something concrete to work with. The outrage, the legal guardianship speech, the "this isn't over" posturing had all been theater. Kane had stood across the table from Roman and performed the role of aggrieved guardian, while his phone was already carrying a conversation with the man he'd agreed to sell a 7-year-old child to. Roman sat with that for a moment. He thought about how Kane's eyes had moved in the room. Not to Roman's face, not to his hands, but to the corners, to the door, building a layout. He had read it at the time as the ordinary territorial surveillance of a man who felt outgunned. He understood now it was something more specific. The anger that moved through him at this realization was clean and very cold, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something sharp, keeping it from the part of his mind that made decisions because anger in the decision-making space was how errors happened. Greer knows she's at this location, Roman said. Almost certainly, Cal said. Which means the park plan is a contingency, not the primary. The primary is this building. Cal was quiet for a moment. That's what I'd conclude, yes. When? If I'm Greer and my buyer's on a 72-hour window and I've already positioned assets in the area, Cal said carefully, I move tonight, after midnight, when the street traffic is down and the building has been on night rotation for a few hours. Roman nodded. He'd already arrived at the same answer. How many men can Greer put on this? Roman said. In Boston. On short notice? He's not a domestic operator. He uses contractors. Cal pulled something up. I found 2 names connected to his logistics network through the Okafor link. Both have records. Assault, firearms charges, local hires. So the ceiling is probably what money can buy in the next 12 hours in this city, which, he paused, calculating, could be anywhere between 4 and 10, depending on who he reaches. Are people in the building right now? 7 on active rotation, 2 on exterior positions. Get it to 12 interior by tonight, Roman said. I want the exterior positions tripled, different sight lines than our current setup. And I want the ground floor door reinforced, not visibly. I don't want anything on the exterior that reads as elevated security. I want them to come in thinking they have the layout. Cal looked at him. You want them to come? I want them to come here, Roman said. Not somewhere else, not somewhere I don't control. Here, where I have the building and the positions, and I know exactly what they're walking into. He paused. If we run from this tonight, it becomes a running problem. We end it here. Cal was quiet for a moment, typing. And Voss. Roman thought about the man at the Langham, the Belgian on the Interpol watch list, in his hotel room somewhere in the financial district, waiting for a package that was a 7-year-old child. He thought about the 2 previous witness recantations, the watch list notation, the years of uninterrupted operation. Voss I'm going to handle differently, Roman said, but not tonight. Tonight is Greer's people. He stood. Get me the 12 by 6 o'clock. He went back upstairs. Baka. Lily was asleep by 8:30, which was earlier than the previous night, but Roman understood it. The day had been heavy in ways she couldn't fully articulate, and her body was doing the thing bodies do under sustained stress, demanding unconsciousness as maintenance. Nora had set her up in the small room off the main floor that was used as a secondary office and had a cot in it for the occasions when someone needed to stay the night at the building. There was a lock on the interior side that Nora showed Lily how to use, demonstrating it twice, slowly, until Lily nodded that she understood. What if someone comes, Lily had said, not anxiously. Again, that flat, practical tone, asking for information. Nobody comes through that door without me or Roman, Nora said. And neither of us will come without knocking 3 times first. If you hear 3 knocks, it's safe. Lily had considered this system, apparently found it structurally sound, and gone to bed. Roman stationed himself in the main room with Frankie. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said. Frankie cleaned a handgun he hadn't used in 6 months, and Roman sat at the table with coffee that went cold and watched the clock on the wall. At 11:40, one of the exterior cameras picked up movement. 4 men, approaching from the east side of the building. They were moving in the specific way that men move when they've been told the layout of somewhere they haven't been. Slightly deliberate, checking positions against a mental map. 2 peeled toward the side access door. 2 continued toward the rear entrance. At the same moment, one of Roman's men on the north exterior position reported a 5th figure holding position at the end of the block, not moving, watching the building's front. Roman's phone showed him all of it in a split-screen feed. He counted 5. Frankie counted 5 beside him. Where's the 6th? Frankie said. Roman looked at the feed. He scanned each camera position, then scanned the blind spots. The places his cameras didn't reach, the angles that the building's architecture created. There was one on the west side between the dumpster enclosure and the fire escape ladder, a space about 8 feet wide that the camera on the corner clipped but didn't fully cover. West side, the gap by the fire escape, Roman said. He's already in position. Frankie's jaw tightened. They had our camera positions. Yes, Roman said. They had the camera positions, which meant Kane's reconnaissance that morning had been more thorough than Roman had credited, or Greer had supplemental information from another source. Either way, someone had done real work on this building in the past 12 hours, and Roman filed that information away for the conversation he was going to have with Greer when this was finished. Hold on my call, Roman said into the radio. He kept his voice flat and even. Nobody moves until I say. The 2 men at the side access door were working the lock. It was a good lock. It took them 4 minutes, which told Roman they were competent but not specialized. When it opened and they came through into the security corridor, they found 2 of Roman's men waiting in the dark, and the encounter was fast and absolute and left both of Greer's men on the floor before either of them had processed what they'd walked into. The rear entrance went differently. The door opened faster. Someone had a bypass tool, which meant Greer had invested more in this team than Roman had estimated, and the 2 men from the rear got 3 steps into the ground floor before they hit the containment. One of them made it back to the door. He didn't make it through it. The man at the fire escape gap got onto the building's exterior wall before one of Roman's exterior people reached him. He came down when he was asked to come down, which saved everyone time. The figure at the end of the block ran when the radio went quiet and the building lights came on. He was fast. Roman's exterior man was faster, but only by a margin. And what changed the outcome was that the man ran in the wrong direction, away from the main street and into the alley that backed against the building's north wall, which was a dead end, and he had time to register that fact before he ran out of runway. By 12:40, the ground floor of the building held 6 men who had arrived to take a 7-year-old child and were now seated on the concrete floor of the storage room with their hands behind them, and Roman stood in the doorway looking at them. He looked at each face. None of them were Greer. He had known Greer wouldn't come himself. Operators at Greer's level didn't expose themselves to the execution layer. But he'd harbored a specific, controlled hope, and the absence of Greer's face in this room meant the problem was still partial. The network was disrupted, but not severed. Greer was still in the city. Voss was still in the city. And the clock had not stopped running just because 6 contractors were now sitting on Roman's floor. He walked to the man in the center of the group who looked like the senior figure, older, steadier, not making the kinds of small, involuntary movements the others were making. Roman crouched in front of him. "Greer's location," Roman said. The man looked at him. He had the look of someone who had decided in advance how he was going to handle exactly this scenario and was currently applying that decision. "I don't know that name," the man said. Roman looked at him for a moment. "You're going to," he said. What followed took 40 minutes and involved cal rather than violence, which was characteristic of Roman's preferred methodology when time allowed. Financial records, identity documents, the specific kind of pressure that targeted what a man stood to lose rather than what could be taken from his body. By the end of those 40 minutes, the man's practiced composure had undergone a significant revision, and Roman had a location. A warehouse space in South Boston, leased 6 weeks ago under a company name that took Cal 11 minutes to penetrate. Greer had been using it as a staging area. He was there now, waiting for a delivery that was not going to arrive. Roman stood up. He looked at Frankie. "Get the car," he said. Frankie was already moving. Roman went upstairs and stood outside the door to the small room where Lily was sleeping. He put his hand flat against the door and stood there for a moment. Not quite a pause, not quite a decision. Both of those had already happened. Just a moment of acknowledgement before the next part of the night began. Then he went downstairs. He was in the car and 2 blocks from the building when his phone rang. The number on the screen was one he didn't recognize, and he almost declined it on instinct, but something, some calibration below the rationale, the same instinct that had kept him alive through more situations than he could cleanly number, made him answer. The voice on the other end was not Greer's. It was Kane's. But it wasn't the Kane who had sat across the table from him that morning with his manufactured outrage and his reconnaissance eyes. This was a different register, higher, uneven, a man speaking from somewhere past the limit of the composure he'd been performing all day. "She's not in the building," Kane said. Roman's hand tightened on the phone. "What did you say?" "The girl," Kane said. "She's not in your building right now. We have her." The car was still moving. Roman did not tell the driver to stop. He sat completely still in the back seat and breathed through his nose once, twice, and looked at the city moving past the window. "Put her on the phone," Roman said. A pause, a shuffling sound, and then Lily's voice, small, controlled, frightened in the way she was frightened, which was the way that tried very hard not to be, came through the line. "I'm okay," she said immediately, which meant she'd been told to say it, and which meant someone in that room was standing close enough to coach her words, and which told Roman more about the immediate threat level than the words themselves. "I know you are," Roman said. His voice was completely level. "I'm coming." The line went back to Kane. "Greer's location," Kane said. "You're going to the warehouse. You're going to walk in and tell Greer it's done, that you're withdrawing. No games, no recording. You walk in, you tell him it's over, and you walk out, and then you get a location." Kane's voice cracked slightly at the edge of the last sentence, the crack of a man who was performing authority from a position of complete desperation, reading from a script someone else had written for him. "You have 40 minutes. The call ended. Roman sat in the back of the car for 3 seconds. Then he said to the driver, very quietly, "Keep driving." He picked up the second phone, the one that ran on a separate network, the one he used for the things that required a separate network, and called Frankie, who was in the car behind him. "She's not in the building," Roman said, Someone got her out. He paused, and the pause contained the weight of everything he'd built in this business and the specific limit it had just encountered. Find out how. He hung up. He looked at the city. Somewhere between 8:30 and midnight, while he had been watching cameras and managing contractors on his ground floor, while he had been certain Lily was locked in that small room with the 3-knock system and the interior bolt, someone had reached her. And the only people who knew about the 3-knock system were the people in this building. The drive to South Boston took 11 minutes. Roman spent those 11 minutes on the phone, not speaking, listening. Frankie had gone back into the building the moment Roman's call ended and was working through it room by room, methodically, the way Frankie did everything when the situation required precision over speed. The building's interior security team was doing the same from the opposite end. They were looking for the gap, the place where the 3-knock system had failed, where someone had reached a locked room and extracted a sleeping child without triggering a single camera or alarm. At minute 7, Frankie called back. "West stairwell," he said. "Emergency exit on the secondary landing. The magnetic lock was disengaged from the inside. Someone used a maintenance override code." Roman's jaw tightened. Who has the maintenance codes? A pause. Not a long one. Frankie had already worked this out, had been working it out since he started walking. Roman could tell by the quality of the pause. It was the pause of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have. 4 people, Frankie said. Me, Cal, Nora, and Danny Cho. Danny Cho was 27 years old and had been with Roman's operation for 3 years. He handled building logistics, maintenance schedules, vendor access, equipment inventory. He was quiet, reliable, forgettable, in the specific way that people who are good at logistics tend to be forgettable. He had unremarkable performance, unremarkable habits, and an unremarkable apartment in Charlestown that Roman had never had reason to examine. "Where is he now?" Roman said. "Not in the building," Frankie said. "He clocked out at 9. Nobody flagged it because his shift ended at 9. "His shift ended at 9, Roman said. "Yes." Roman looked out the window at the city sliding past. He thought about Danny Cho clocking out at 9 p.m., 20 minutes after Lily had gone to sleep, and he thought about what that timing meant and what it cost to buy 3 years of quiet reliability and then spend it all in a single night, and he thought about the specific shape of what Danny Cho had done. Not the mechanics of it, but the weight of it. The fact of having been in the building every day for 3 years, having been trusted, having been part of the structure, and having made a different calculation when a number with enough zeros appeared. "Find him," Roman said. "Already on it," Frankie said. "Alive," Roman said. "I need him talking." He ended the call. The car pulled off the main road into the network of side streets that backed the industrial section of South Boston, and Roman looked through the windshield at the dark buildings and the orange sodium light and the flat black of the channel in the distance and ran the 40-minute window in his head. Kane had called at 12:50. It was now 1:16. He had 24 minutes to walk into a room with Greer and perform a specific piece of theater while simultaneously locating Lily, reaching Danny Cho, and maintaining enough operational coherence that the entire situation didn't collapse into something unrecoverable. He thought about Lily's voice on the phone, small, controlled. The word "okay" delivered the way she delivered everything, with careful precision, rationing. The terror underneath it not in what she'd said, but in what she hadn't. She hadn't cried. She hadn't called for him. She had delivered the coached line, and then there was nothing else because she knew, somehow, in that old and weathered way of hers, that keeping herself together was the most useful thing she could do. A 7-year-old child managing herself in the dark to make it easier for him to work. Roman's hand, resting on his thigh, closed into a fist and opened again. "Stop here," he said to the driver. They were half a block from the warehouse address. "Keep the engine running." He got out alone. The warehouse was a converted loading facility. Wide, low, the kind of building that had received freight in a previous life and now received whatever its current tenants required. The exterior was unremarkable. One large roll door closed, and a personnel entrance set into the side wall, the kind with a heavy handle and no visible lock mechanism on the outside, which meant the lock was electronic and the control was internal. There was a light on somewhere inside, diffused through a row of high, frosted windows set just below the roofline. Roman went to the personnel door and knocked. Not hard, not soft. The knock of a man arriving for an appointment. 30 seconds. Then the door opened. The man who opened it was large and did not introduce himself. He stepped back and Roman walked through and the door closed behind him and he stood in the antechamber of the warehouse. A narrow space, maybe 12 feet, that separated the entrance from the main floor. There were two more men in the antechamber. One of them gestured for Roman to raise his arms, which Roman did, and the search was professional and found the handgun at his hip and the knife at his ankle and a third thing in his jacket's interior pocket that the man almost missed and didn't quite. All of it, the man said. Roman handed over the interior pocket item, which was a secondary phone. He did not hand over the thing taped to the inside of his left forearm under his shirt sleeve, because the search had not gone that far and he had been counting on it not going that far. They walked him through to the main floor. The warehouse space was mostly empty, cleared of whatever had been in it previously, the concrete floor bare and clean under the overhead industrial lights. At the far end, near where the roll door was, there was a folding table and 3 chairs and a lamp on an extension cord that created a pool of warmer light separate from the overhead fluorescence. A man was sitting at the table. Greer was smaller than Roman had pictured. Not short, average height, maybe 5'10", but narrow in the way that certain men go narrow when they spend most of their time behind communication channels rather than in front of problems. He was in his 50s, with a precise haircut and clothes that were better than the venue warranted, and he looked at Roman coming across the warehouse floor with the expression of a man who was accustomed to being the most composed person in any given room and was currently applying that composure as a deliberate instrument. He gestured to the chair across from him. Roman sat. "Mr. Holloway," Greer said. He had a light accent, mid-Atlantic, the kind that had been worked on, smoothed down, the original underneath it something European that he'd spent time erasing. "I appreciate the promptness." "Where is she?" Roman said. "She's comfortable," Greer said. "She's warm and she's been given something to eat and she's perfectly fine. She'll remain that way for the duration of our conversation. And if I don't say what you want." Greer's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Roman looked at him steadily. He thought about how many men he'd sat across from in his life who believed that composure was the same thing as control, and how many of them had ended up revising that belief. He looked at Greer's hands on the table, still, precise, and at his eyes, which were pale gray and doing the work of a man who was running calculations behind an empty expression. "You want me to withdraw from the Kane situation," Roman said. "Pull my security from the girl, remove myself from the guardianship question, and let Kane transfer custody through whatever mechanism he's arranged with you." "What I want," Greer said, "is for a business arrangement that was functioning perfectly well before you introduced yourself to it to resume functioning. Nothing more complicated than that." "And Voss," Roman said. Something moved in Greer's eyes. A small, controlled thing, but Roman caught it. The fact that Roman knew Voss's name was information Greer had not expected to encounter and was now recalibrating around. "Mr. Voss is a client," Greer said. "His specifics aren't relevant to our conversation." "He's at the Langham," Roman said. "Room 417. He flew in on a Belgian passport under his own name, which tells me he's either very confident in his arrangements or very stupid, and the Interpol watch file suggests it's the former." He paused. "He's been doing this for years. You've been facilitating it for years, and you're sitting here right now expecting me to step aside and let you continue." Greer looked at him. The composure was still in place, but it had shifted slightly, the way a mask shifts when the face underneath it moves without the mask catching up. "You're a man who operates outside conventional law," Greer said. "I would think you'd appreciate the practical position." "I operate outside conventional law," Roman said, "in specific ways, for specific reasons. There are categories of business I don't touch. There are lines I don't cross. Not because of sentiment, because some things corrupt everything they contact and the cost of that contamination is higher than any profit." He held Greer's gaze. "This is one of those things." "Then we have a problem," Greer said. "We have a problem," Roman agreed. Greer leaned back slightly. He looked at Roman with the look of a man reconsidering the dimensions of a situation. "You came here alone," he said. "Yes." "You're not wired." "My weapons were taken at the door," Roman said. "You can believe I'm not wired or not. It doesn't change the conversation." "The conversation," Greer said, "seems to have a limited number of available outcomes. You either walk out of here and remove yourself from the situation, or you try to hold me here as secondary leverage," Roman said, "which creates a problem for you. Because the people I work with know where I am, and if I don't make a specific contact in," he looked at his watch, 14 minutes, the situation becomes significantly more expensive for you than it currently is. Greer studied him. "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," Roman said. "It's a waste of the other person's time and mine." The room was very quiet. One of the men near the wall shifted his weight. The lamp on the extension cord hummed its single note. Then Roman's phone. The one they hadn't taken, the secondary. The one taped to his forearm that he'd retrieved in the chair when he sat down and transferred to his jacket pocket in the same motion, buzzed twice. The signal he'd been waiting for. He looked at Greer. "Before you answer," Roman said, "I want to show you something." He placed the phone on the table and turned the screen toward Greer. It showed a document, a financial record, dense with transaction data, account numbers, dates. Greer's eyes moved to it with the involuntary focus of a man who recognized what he was looking at before he'd decided whether to look. "That's a partial record," Roman said. "It covers 6 transactions between your logistics network and Voss's acquisition channels over the last 4 years. It's currently in the possession of 3 separate people, none of whom are in this building. One of them has instructions to transmit it to a federal task force contact in the event that I don't make contact in..." He checked his watch again. 12 minutes. Greer looked at the document. His composure was still present, but it had become effortful. Roman could see the effort now, which meant the composure had become a performance, which meant Greer had moved from confident to managing. "That's not admissible," Greer said. "Admissible isn't the point," Roman said. "The point is that a federal task force opens an investigation that takes 4 months, during which time every one of your active arrangements gets a microscope on it. Every client gets nervous, every contractor gets unreliable, and your entire network spends those 4 months wondering whether you're the liability. You've survived on nobody looking too closely for a long time. I'm offering you the choice of whether that changes tonight." Greer's jaw was tight. He looked at the phone screen for another moment. Then he looked up at Roman. "The girl is yours," he said. It came out flat. The words of a man who had done the math and arrived at an answer he didn't want, but could accept because it was survivable. "Whatever arrangement Kane made with me is dissolved. I have no further interest in the situation." "And Voss," Roman said. "Mr. Voss will find his arrangements elsewhere," Greer said. "That's between him and me." "I'll want Voss's documentation," Roman said. "The client file. Everything in your system that connects to him." Greer's eyes sharpened. "That wasn't part of..." "It is now," Roman said. He held Greer's gaze without blinking. "You want to walk away from this clean? That's the price. Voss's file, complete, within 24 hours, to Cal Reeves, who you'll be contacted by." Silence. Greer looked at him for a long moment, running the calculation visible in the tight muscles of his face. "Agreed," he said. Roman picked up the phone. He stood. "The girl," he said. "Now some..." They brought her in from a side room he hadn't seen from the main floor. A smaller space, a former office maybe, with a closed door. When the door opened, Roman was already crossing the warehouse floor, and Lily came through it in the arms of a woman he didn't recognize, a woman who had the look of someone hired to manage the logistics of transporting children, and who was holding Lily with the practiced neutrality of a person for whom this was a professional task, rather than a human one. Lily saw Roman and went absolutely rigid in the woman's arms, and then she was reaching, both arms, the instinctive full-body reach of a child toward the one person in the room who was not a threat. And Roman crossed the remaining distance in 4 steps and took her, and she wrapped around him with a grip that was extraordinary for how small she was, her arms around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder. And she didn't make a sound. Not a cry, not a word. Just that grip. That total, wordless, maximal grip. He stood in the warehouse with her, and his hand was on the back of her head, and he held her and looked over her shoulder at Greer, who was still at the table, and at the men along the walls, and at the door. "We're done," Roman said. Nobody moved to stop them. He walked her out through the personnel entrance and into the cold South Boston night, and the car was half a block away, and he carried her the full distance because she hadn't loosened her grip, and he wasn't asking her to. In the car she finally spoke. Her voice came from somewhere against his jacket, muffled. "I didn't make a sound," she said, "when they came in. I didn't call for help. I didn't want to make it harder." Roman looked at the top of her head. He thought about a 7-year-old child alone in a dark room, managing herself into silence to make it easier for him to work. "I know," he said. "Are we going back to the house?" "Yes." A pause. Her grip hadn't loosened. "Is it safe now?" Roman thought about Danny Cho, who Frankie was currently locating. He thought about Greer's agreement, which was the agreement of a man who had assessed his options and chosen the survivable one, and would hold to it because violating it was worse for him than honoring it. He thought about Voss at the Langham, who did not yet know that his arrangements had dissolved, but who would find out in the morning, and who would be addressed in the morning through the documentation Greer was going to provide, and through the federal contact who was going to receive that documentation, along with everything Cal had built on the man's history. "Getting there," Roman said. But she... Danny Cho was found at 2:40 in the morning in a parking garage in Charlestown, sitting in his car, going nowhere. He had the look of a man who had done the thing and was now sitting with the weight of having done it and had not yet figured out what the next step was, which told Roman that Danny had not been prepared for the part that came after. Frankie called when they had him. Roman took the call outside the main room, out of Lily's hearing. Lily was back on the couch, the blanket around her, Nora beside her, not sleeping yet, but getting there, the adrenaline of the night slowly releasing its grip. "How much?" Roman said. 30,000, Frankie said. Kane approached him 2 weeks ago, said he just needed someone to disengage the lock at a specific time. Danny says Kane told him it was about recovering a family member who was being held without consent. Roman stood in the hallway and looked at the wall. He believed that. "He says he believed it," Frankie said. By the time he understood what it actually was, the money was in his account and the thing was done. Roman thought about $30,000 and 3 years of trust. He thought about what Kane had told Danny, the specific framing, the language of a man recovering a family member. And he thought about how good a liar needed to be to take someone who worked in this building and had some understanding of what this building contained and flip them in 2 weeks for $30,000. Kane, it turned out, was good enough. "Bring him in," Roman said. "I'll talk to him tonight." He went back to the main room. Nora looked up. Lily was asleep, finally, the blanket pulled up, her face the smooth, unguarded face of sleep that was different from her waking face in a way that Roman noticed every time. The complete release of the managed expression she maintained while conscious, the thing her face did when she was no longer performing composure for a world that required it. Roman sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her sleep and let the night settle around him. The warehouse was done. Greer was done. Voss would be done by tomorrow afternoon. Those were the solvable problems, and they were being solved. What remained was Kane. Daryl Kane, who had stood across Roman's table performing grievance while his phone carried the architecture of what he'd planned, who had spent 2 weeks engineering the compromise of this building's security through a man who hadn't understood what he was enabling, who had a 7-year-old child's nighttime extraction on his hands, along with $68,000 in debt and a dissolved arrangement and nowhere left to go. Kane was the last problem. And Kane, Roman had decided sometime during the drive back from South Boston, was going to be handled face-to-face, not through intermediaries, not through documentation and pressure applied from a distance. Face-to-face, in a room, with everything Roman had assembled about the man's history laid out on the table between them, and Kane looking at what his life had built and what it was about to cost him. Roman looked at Lily. She had walked 11 blocks in January and asked 12 strangers if they knew anyone who wanted a child. 11 of them had walked away. He looked at her sleeping face and thought about what the next 48 hours required, and about the specific quality of clarity that arrives when you have been through enough of a night that the questions stop and only the actions remain. He picked up his phone and sent a single message to Frankie. Set up the warehouse on Harbor. Tomorrow night. Just Kane. Nobody else. He set the phone face down on the table. He poured water. He sat in the chair and watched the door and let the building settle around him and thought about the conversation he was going to have with Daryl Kane in a warehouse on the harbor, with every document Cal had assembled and every piece of evidence the night had produced, and the specific and absolute thing he was going to say when the last card was on the table and Kane had nowhere left to stand. The feared mafia boss who once ruled through power would not need a single weapon for what came next. What Daryl Kane was going to face in that warehouse was something older and more absolute than any gun Roman had ever carried. The full, undivided attention of a man who had decided, without reservation and without exit, that this particular fight was the only one that mattered. The clock on the wall read 3:07. Tomorrow night, it ended. The harbor warehouse smelled like salt and old wood and the particular cold of a building that had been closed against winter for weeks, and held that cold in its bones the way stone holds it, deep and patient and indifferent to whatever happened inside its walls. Roman arrived at 7 in the evening. He came with Frankie and two other men whose names didn't need to be in this part of the story because their function was containment, and their presence was precautionary, and what was going to happen in this building tonight was not going to require them. Roman knew this the way he knew most things about rooms he was about to enter. Not from calculation alone, but from the specific gravity of what had been building toward this for 4 days, the accumulated weight of it, and the way that weight always resolved in the end into something simpler and quieter than it promised on the approach. Cal had sent everything. It was printed and bound, not elegantly, just stapled, the way Cal did things, functional without performance. And Roman carried it in his left hand and set it on the table at the center of the warehouse floor and put a lamp on the table beside it and waited. Kane arrived at 7:40. He was brought by two men who had located him at his house in Dorchester, where he had apparently been sitting for 20 hours doing nothing, which told Roman that the dissolution of the Greer arrangement had reached him and that he was now in the specific paralysis of a man who had spent all his contingencies and was waiting for the consequence. He looked worse than he had 2 days ago. The performance of authority was completely gone. What was left was just a man, big, soft-jawed, with pale eyes that had been through something and not come out clean on the other side. He walked into the warehouse and saw Roman at the table and stopped. "Sit down," Roman said. This time Kane sat without the protest. He pulled the chair out and sat in it and put his hands on the table and looked at the bound document and then at Roman's face. Roman sat across from him. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at Daryl Kane for a long moment, not speaking, letting the room be what it was, cold and quiet and completely honest, the kind of room where performance cost more than it returned, and both men in it understood that. "I'm going to tell you what I have," Roman said, "and then you're going to sign some things, and then we're going to talk about what happens next, and that's the entire conversation. You understand?" Kane's jaw worked. "Where is she?" he said. "She's safe," Roman said. "She's not a part of this conversation." She's not yours," Roman said. The words came out flat and final, not loud, not heated. The way true things come out when the person saying them has been carrying the truth long enough that it no longer needs emphasis. "She was never yours. You were assigned a responsibility that you converted into a transaction, and the only reason you have any claim on paper is because a family court processed a filing without adequate investigation. That ends tonight." Kane looked at him. The pale eyes were doing something complicated, cycling through things. Roman could see the cycling, the sequence of a man running through remaining options and finding them closed. "You can't just open it," Roman said, nodding at the document. Kane looked at it. He didn't move for a moment. Then he put his hands on it and opened it. He read slowly. Roman watched him read. He watched Kane's face as it moved through the pages. The financial records first, the Okafor debt laid out in transaction detail, the communication records with Greer, the text messages including the one from 6 days ago where Kane had asked when they could finalize the arrangement. He watched Kane's jaw tighten, and then go slack, and then tighten again. The involuntary musculature of a man absorbing documentation of his own actions, in the specific horror of seeing them rendered in black ink on white paper, permanent and irrefutable, and utterly without the context he'd been using to make them tolerable to himself. Then the medical section. Cal had pulled Lily's pediatric records from before Marcus Bennett died, the healthy weight percentiles, the developmental check marks, the clean bills of health from a child who had parents who brought her to appointments, and then the gap, and then the single emergency room record from 8 months into Kane's guardianship, when Lily had been brought in with a fractured wrist that the attending physician's notes described as inconsistent with the reported mechanism of injury. The report had been filed. A follow-up had been scheduled. The follow-up had never happened because the address given was wrong and no one had pursued it. Kane stopped reading at that page. He sat very still with his hands on the paper and didn't turn the page for a long time. "She told me she fell," he said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. Not remorse exactly, too complicated for that simple word, but something adjacent to it, something that might have been remorse if there had been more of a self underneath it to generate the feeling cleanly. "She fell," Roman said, "off the back step. She said what she needed to say," Roman said, "to not make it worse. That's what she does. She manages the situation to reduce the damage. She's been doing it for 22 months. He paused. "She's 7 years old." The lamp on the table hummed. The warehouse held its cold. Outside, the harbor moved against the pilings with a low, repetitive sound, patient and indifferent. Kane looked at his hands on the document. They were large hands, rough at the knuckles, and they were not steady. Roman watched them and thought about what those hands had done and stored that thought in the place where he kept things that required a specific kind of discipline to hold without acting on immediately. "Renata," Kane said, not loudly, almost to himself. "She never said anything." "Your wife is afraid of you," Roman said. "You know that." A long silence. "The last 3 pages," Roman said. "Read them." Kane turned to the last 3 pages. They were legal documents. A voluntary relinquishment of guardianship rights, drafted by a lawyer whose name and credentials were on the header, clean and formal and completely airtight, according to the 2 additional lawyers Cal had consulted to verify it. Beside the documents were 2 other items. A written agreement stipulating that Kane would have no further contact with Lily Bennett, signed under acknowledgement that violation would result in immediate transmission of the complete document package to federal authorities. And a third document that was not legal in the formal sense, but was the kind of agreement that, in Roman's world, carried more enforceability than anything a court could produce. A statement signed by Greer under separate arrangement, confirming the nature of the transaction Kane had attempted to facilitate. Kane read the last 3 pages. He set them down. "If I don't sign," he said. "The package goes to the FBI field office," Roman said. "Not through a third party, not through an anonymous tip, directly from my lawyer, with a cover letter. Child endangerment, attempted trafficking, financial fraud connected to an illegal gambling operation." He paused. "You'll be arrested before the week ends. The case will not be difficult to prosecute because the documentation is complete and the witnesses, including Greer, who has already signed a separate agreement to cooperate with federal inquiry in exchange for considerations I arranged, are in place." Kane's face had gone pale in a way that was permanent now, not the pallor of shock, but the gray of a man who was seeing the room clearly for the first time and understanding its dimensions. "And if I sign," he said. "The package stays where it is," Roman said. "Sealed, held. You leave Boston. I don't care where you go. You leave Renata. That's her decision to make going forward, not yours. You settle the Okafor debt through a payment arrangement I've already negotiated on your behalf, because Okafor is a practical man, and $68,000 at 20 cents on the dollar is preferable to the complications that would come from you being incarcerated before he's collected." He held Kane's gaze. "And you never contact, approach, or attempt to locate Lily again. For the rest of your life." Silence. "You negotiated my debt," Kane said. I protected an arrangement that keeps you functional enough to disappear quietly, Roman said. Don't confuse it for generosity. Kane looked at the documents. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the lamp. He was going through something. Roman could see it. The internal motion of a man dismantling the version of events he'd been living inside and having to stand in the open space where it had been. She didn't deserve any of it, Kane said. It came out quietly, without setup, the way things come out when they bypass the part of the brain that manages presentation. Roman looked at him. I know that, Kane said. I knew it when I knew it. He stopped. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something that was neither crying nor its absence, but the specific struggle of a man trying to contain something that had been stored badly for a long time. The debt got past what I could see anymore. Everything was about the number. What could fix the number? He paused. She was the only thing I had that was worth anything to anyone. The room was very quiet. Roman sat with what Kane had just said. He didn't grant it absolution, and he didn't argue with it. It was true, in the specific, ugly way that things are true when a person has been cornered into honesty by the removal of every alternative. Kane had done what he'd done, and the reason was what it was, and neither the reason nor the admission changed what had been done or what needed to happen next. Roman understood this distinction. He had always been clear on it. Sign the documents, Roman said. Kane picked up the pen that had been beside the papers. He signed the first document, then the second, then the third. His signature was large and unsteady, the signature of a man who writes his name that way when he is very tired or very far from himself. Roman took the documents. He stacked them, aligned the edges, and put them inside the folder he'd brought. He stood. Someone will drive you home, he said. You have 2 weeks to leave Boston. After 2 weeks, if you're still in the city, the arrangement changes. Kane was still sitting. He looked like a man who wasn't sure his legs would work correctly yet. What happens to her? He said. Roman stopped. He looked at Kane across the table in the lamplight of the harbor warehouse, and he thought about whether this question deserved an answer. He decided it did not. Some questions earn their answers, and some don't. This one didn't. He left the warehouse, and Frankie fell into step beside him, and they walked to the car in the cold harbor air, and Roman got in and sat in the back seat and held the folder on his lap and looked through the windshield at the dark water. Frankie got in the passenger side and looked at him. Done? He said. Done, Roman said. Two things happened in the weeks that followed, in the specific order that things happen when a crisis resolves and the space it occupied begins to fill with something else. The first was that Aldrich Voss, the Belgian at the Langham, left Boston on the third morning after the warehouse without Roman ever meeting him directly. What he left in response to was the material Cal transmitted through the federal contact, not a formal filing, not yet, but a communication that made clear to Voss, through channels he understood, that his arrangements in this city had been comprehensively documented and that the documentation was in hands that would know what to do with it. Voss checked out of the Langham at 6 a.m, took a cab to Logan, and boarded a flight to Montreal. The federal contact, a woman named Lena Marsh, whom Roman had dealt with twice before on matters that occupied the specific territory between his world and hers, indicated that an international inquiry had been opened and that the documentation provided was sufficient to initiate it. Roman did not ask for updates. He had done the part that was his to do. The second thing was Renata. Renata Kane called the building's main number 12 days after Darryl left the city. She had found the number through a process Roman didn't ask about, and when Nora answered, she gave her name and said she wanted to speak to whoever was taking care of her niece. Nora put the call through to Roman without commentary. Renata's voice was quiet and careful, the voice of a woman who had spent a long time being careful about how she spoke in the presence of consequences. She said she wasn't calling to ask for anything. She said she understood that Lily was somewhere safe and that the legal situation was being handled and that she wasn't contesting any of it. She said she had one question. Is she eating? Renata asked. Roman thought about Lily at the table that morning, working through a bowl of oatmeal with the focused attention she still brought to food, not the rationing of the first night, something closer to pleasure now, a growing understanding that the bowl would be refilled if it emptied. He thought about the way she'd looked up from it when Frankie made a joke, the small, quick smile. "Yes," Roman said. "She's eating." A pause on the line, a long one. "Okay," Renata said, and then, "She used to like strawberries when her parents were alive. I don't know if she still does." "I'll find out," Roman said. He found out that afternoon. He put a bowl of strawberries on the table near where Lily was doing a drawing. She had discovered, sometime in the second week, that Nora kept a supply of colored pencils in the secondary office and had claimed them with a quiet firmness that Nora had met with a quiet approval. And Lily looked at the strawberries and then at him. "Those are my favorite," she said. "I heard," Roman said. She ate 3 and then looked at the bowl and then at him again, and something moved across her face that he'd been watching develop incrementally over the weeks. A loosening, a slow unbracing, the gradual dismantling of the managed composure she'd worn since before he found her. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way ice goes in early spring, not dramatically, but in degrees, the constant temperature finally crossing the threshold. "Thank you," she said, without the automatic apology attached, just the words, "clean." "You're welcome," Roman said. Burkhardt. The legal process took 4 months. Roman had a lawyer, a woman named Patrice Odom, who had worked for him in various capacities for 11 years, and who was, among other things, the most methodical person he had ever encountered in any professional context. Patrice had looked at the relinquishment documents, at the original family court filing, at the gap in Lily's pediatric records, and the emergency room notation, and had said, without visible emotion, that she could build a case for emergency protective custody within the week and a path to formal adoption within the year. She had been off by 2 months. The formal adoption hearing was scheduled for the 4th month in 2 weeks. In the intervening time, Lily lived at the house, and then, in the 6th week, Roman moved her, and himself and the operational corps, to a larger property in Beacon Hill that had been in a holding company of his for 3 years, and that he had never used for anything because he had never needed the space. He needed it now. The house was a working location, a building designed for function, and Lily needed something that was not a working location. She needed rooms that had natural light and a kitchen that smelled like food and a place to put the drawings that had multiplied over the weeks into a considerable collection. He got her a room. He let her choose the color, which she took very seriously, standing in front of the paint swatches at the hardware store for 22 minutes before settling on a deep teal that she said looked like the ocean when the light was right. Roman didn't know how she knew what the ocean looked like when the light was right. He didn't ask. He painted the room teal. She started school in the 3rd month. Not the school closest to the house, Patrice advised against unnecessary public exposure until the legal process was settled, but a small private school 12 minutes away that had a student body of 200 and a librarian who, on the first day, showed Lily the shelves with the self-evident pride of someone displaying a cathedral, and whose face, when Lily stopped walking and stared, did something that looked very close to recognition. Lily brought books home the way some children brought home stray animals. Roman started finding them in unexpected places, beside the kitchen sink, on the windowsill in the hallway, 2 of them on the floor beside the couch where she fell asleep reading, and the books fell when she did. He stopped moving them. He let them stay where they landed. Frankie came to dinner on Thursdays. This was not a plan anyone had made. It had evolved from a Thursday 3 weeks in when Frankie had arrived to discuss something operational, and Nora had put food on the table because there was food, and he was there. And Lily had sat across from him, and they had resumed their conversation about the reliability of various animals, which had expanded over the weeks to include hedgehogs, harbor seals specifically versus seals in general, and whether birds counted as trustworthy or merely consistent. By the 4th Thursday, it was a fixture. Cal came occasionally. Nora was there most nights. Nora? Roman watched the table sometimes from the counter where he stood with his coffee, and he thought about the fact that this collection of people, a man who ran information networks, a woman who had been managing his operation since before he was the one running it, a deputy who filled rooms with his presence, a child who had walked 3 miles in January to find someone who might want her, had become a thing he didn't have a clean word for. Not a crew, not a team. Something older than those words. Something that required a different category. He didn't name it. He let it be what it was. Mais. The adoption hearing was on a Thursday morning in April, which meant Frankie came and sat in the second row of the small courtroom in a suit he had clearly purchased within the last week, based on the specific stiffness of it, and which meant Cal was there in his perpetually distracted way, sitting very still in a manner that suggested active concentration rather than absence. And Nora sat at the end of the row with her hands folded and her face in its customary careful neutrality that Roman had long since learned to read as something other than what it appeared. Lily wore a dark green dress that she had chosen herself, and dark tights and shoes that she had polished the night before with a focused, private seriousness that Roman had respected by not commenting on. She sat beside Roman at the petitioner's table and kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the judge when the judge spoke and answered questions in her clear, careful voice, the voice that never oversold anything, that offered only exactly what was asked for. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Carolyn Vance, who had been doing this for a long time, and whose manner combined efficiency with a specific quality of human attention that Roman recognized as the product of long practice in rooms where the stakes were not abstract. Judge Vance read the file. She asked Lily several questions: where she lived, what she liked about school, whether she understood what the proceeding was deciding. Lily answered each question with the same focused precision she brought to everything. Then Judge Vance looked at Roman. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "this is an unconventional application in several respects." "Yes, Your Honor," Roman said. "The background investigation returns a complicated picture." "I understand that," Roman said. Judge Vance looked at him for a moment. She looked at Lily. She looked at the documentation in the file. Patrice's documentation, which was thorough and honest in the specific way that Patrice was thorough and honest, which meant it addressed the complications directly, rather than attempting to minimize them. It named what Roman was and what he had been, and it named what he had done for Lily, and it named the current reality. A child who was healthy and enrolled in school and sleeping in a teal room with books on the floor, and a man who had made her those things. "The guardian ad litem's report is unambiguous," Judge Vance said. She looked at Lily again. "And I've spoken with the child independently." She paused. "Ms. Bennett, is there anything you'd like to say before I make my ruling?" Lily looked at the judge. She sat up slightly, not performing, just collecting herself, the way she did before she said something she'd decided was important. "He kept his promise," Lily said. "He said I didn't have to go back, and I never had to go back. He said he'd take care of it, and he did." She paused. "I don't think people keep promises very much." "He does." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Vance looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she looked at her papers. "The application for adoption is granted," she said. "As of today, the minor previously identified as Lily Ann Bennett is legally recognized as Lily Ann Holloway." Patrice, beside Roman, made a small note. Frankie, in the second row, exhaled a breath he'd apparently been holding for some time. Cal looked at his hands. Nora looked at the window. Roman looked at Lily. She was looking at him. Her face was doing the thing it had been slowly learning to do over 4 months. The unguarded thing, the open thing, the expression that existed on the other side of the managed composure she'd worn since before he found her. It was not a dramatic expression. It was not the face of someone overwhelmed by a sudden happiness. It was quieter than that, and more real. The face of someone who had survived long enough to arrive at a thing they had stopped expecting to find, and who was now standing in it carefully, testing the ground. She put her hand on the table between them. Roman looked at it. Then he covered it with his. They went to the harbor afterward because Lily asked to. Not the harbor near the house, the waterfront park farther south, the one with the benches that looked out over the open water where the channel widened and you could see the islands on clear days. April had come in cold, but the sky was bright, the specific bright of early spring that makes everything look newly printed, and they sat on a bench. Lily and Roman, Frankie standing nearby eating something he'd bought from a cart, Cal on his phone 20 feet away, Nora on the far end of the bench with her coffee, and looked at the water. Lily sat with her hands in her pockets and looked at the harbor for a long time. "Is it different?" Roman said. She turned to look at him. "What?" Being Lily Holloway. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to actual questions as opposed to rhetorical ones. It sounds different when I say it, she said, like it belongs to someone. A pause. Like it belongs to me. Roman looked at the water. A container ship was moving slowly through the channel, enormous and unhurried, working toward the open sea. It does, he said. Lily watched the ship. Am I still going to have to apologize for things? Things you actually did wrong, yes, Roman said. Things you exist, no. She nodded, processing. Okay, she said. Then, I still do it sometimes. By accident. I know, Roman said. It'll get better. She looked at the ship. Then she looked at him with the sideways look she used when she was about to say something she'd been considering for a while and had finally decided to say. Dad, she said. She said it the way you say a word you've been carrying around for a while to see how it sounds out loud. Carefully, testing its weight in the air between them. Not a question, not a statement. Something in between, something that was asking whether the word fit without being willing to frame it as a question, because questions could be declined, and this was not something she wanted to offer a declination route to. Roman turned to look at her. She was watching him with those eyes, dark and careful and enormous in her face, the eyes that had been old since the night he found her, and that were, in the past 4 months, becoming something else. Not younger, exactly. More layered, old and new at the same time. The eyes of a child who had been through something and was building something different on the other side of it. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about who he had been when he walked out of Arden and found her on the sidewalk in the cold. He thought about the distance between that man and the one sitting on this bench, and about what it had cost to cross it, and about whether the word cost was even the right frame. Cost implied something given up. He wasn't sure anything had been given up. He thought, looking at Lily, that it was closer to the opposite, that what the 4 months had required was not a subtraction, but an addition. The addition of something he hadn't known was missing, which was the hardest kind of missing to locate because it had no obvious shape until it was filled. Yeah, he said. Not elaborately, not with the full weight of the thing pressed into the word. Just, yeah, plain, true. Lily looked at the water. Something settled in her face, the final degree of a settling that had been happening for 4 months. The last small tension releasing, the way a room goes quiet after the last door in a hallway closes and the sound finishes moving through the walls, and then there is only stillness. Frankie, 20 feet away, had apparently been listening and was looking very carefully at the middle distance in the manner of a man who is managing his face. Cal, on his phone, was not on his phone. Nora looked at the harbor and drank her coffee and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing available to her. The container ship moved through the channel, slow and massive, and the wake it made reached the shore in long, low waves that came in with the patience of things that have always been coming, that will always come, that don't require an audience or a verdict, that simply move from where they started toward where they were always going. Lily leaned slightly, by perhaps 2 inches, toward Roman on the bench. Not dramatically. 2 inches. Her shoulder finding the edge of his arm. He didn't move away. They sat on the bench in the April light and looked at the water, and the city moved behind them the way cities always move, without pausing, without acknowledging the specific gravity of the small things that happen within it. And the feared man who had once measured his worth in the scale of his power sat beside the girl who had walked out of the dark to find him, and the distance between what he had been and what he was now was not visible in any dramatic external thing. It was visible only in this, the bench, the water, the child's shoulder against his arm, the word she'd said, and the word he'd said back. Small things. True things. The kind that don't announce themselves. The kind that last